Well, I mean, at this point, who can deny it? The United States is in clear decline. It's racked by demographic and dysgenic chaos. Its leadership is utterly incompetent, corrupt, and vehemently opposed to any kind of reform. Its economy has been decimated by the coronavirus. Its military is shackled with politicization, and it's now been humiliated by severe corruption in Afghanistan. And as this United States declines, many expect China to fill its void and to become a true sole global superpower in its wake. That a Pax Americana will be replaced by a Pax Sinatica. I deeply doubt this for numerous reasons. First, though, China will be no more able to deal with resource depletion or its own dysgenics any more than the United States would. But this is the same for any nation in the future. The reason that people think China will become a sole superpower or hyperpower is that many people fail to understand America's role in the world and why and how it was able to attain and keep it. Many leftists unequivocally call the United States an empire. And this is under the influence of, two scholar activists who were really key at the end of the 20th century, Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn, where the global power structure is made into the American empire, where America pretends to enforce a Westphalian sovereignty, but through economic jockeying, military intimidation, underhanded use of covert forces such as the CIA and NSA, it actually, in fact, rules the greatest and most expansive empire in history. Now, there is some truth to the idea of the American empire, but in general, I think that this is very self-serving for the leftists and has no real merit other than its use for propaganda. First off, the United States is an empire. It's multicultural, it's multi-ethnic, and multiracial nation, and it's larger than the Roman, Ottoman, or Persian empires ever were. America is not a nation state even if it's being portrayed as one in its educational system or in the popular media. There are multiple distinct cultures which use their own languages. You have the Indian tribes, you have all the all the people in the Southwest, right? They were speaking Spanish as their first language. You have the Creole, you have the Hawaiians, you have Puerto Ricans, you have the Anabaptists that are speaking their versions of German. There is also a great deal of cultural difference between the various English speakers. You got black Americans who obviously view themselves as their own nation. But you also have regional identity for English-speaking whites that varies region to region. Most empires in history have ruled directly over their colonies or subjugated peoples. America has done this in the peoples it's conquered. The Caribbean, Pacific, the American Indian, and the Southerners. It doesn't do this with its allies, Canada, Mexico, Britain, Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, South Korea. Even if America has bases here, and even if sometimes it was established by force, say in the case of Italy or Germany or Japan, none of these states pay tribute to the United States. If it intervenes in the affairs of another nation, it usually does so through soft power, not hard power. Now, I'm not being black and white here. Nations do rule as imperial states through vassals or puppet states often. So in the 20th century, we got the Soviet Union with all the states that were subservient to it in Warsaw Pact and others such as Mongolia. And then we have Imperial Japan or, Manchukuo and its various independent Asian republics that was starting during the Pacific War. But can we really say this of the United States after World War II? And I would say no. You look at the first half of the 20th century, you can say yes. You have all those banana wars and the establishment of puppets in America invading over and over again. But once the good neighbor policy is instilled, America steps away from its empire. And these Latin American countries were allowed to go their own way. I'm not saying that America didn't have economic influence, but, since the invasion of the Dominican Republic in 65, American invasions in Latin America are few and far in between. And the Philippines got to have its own independence. When we look at America's main competitor in the second half of the 20th century, we see a country which invades its allies to keep them pacified over and over again. 56, we got the invasion of Hungary. 68, we got Czechoslovakia. And then in 79, they had Afghanistan. If a nation disagreed with the Soviet Union or tried to break free of its control, the Soviet Union under the Brezhnev Doctrine would invade it. In the case of the United States, if the Philippines or Iraq, both minor powers, say we don't want you anymore, America withdraws. And, say what you will about the Soviet Union, most of those states were paying tribute, and their whole economic system was under Soviet management. That's not the case here with America. And contrary to Nat Sock talking points, if Germany wanted to leave NATO, it would be allowed to leave NATO. And, France was allowed to leave the command structure and almost left NATO. So then, if America, in regard to NATO, in regard to Japan, in regard to Australia, in regard to South Korea, in regard to the Gulf states, is it an empire, then what is it? I'm going to prefer the term hegemony here, and that comes from ancient Greece. And that's where one state influences the other states in its sphere through its military, economic, and cultural preeminence rather than ruling directly through military force. The states in its sphere of influence are independent but willing to accept a secondary role out of a mutual benefit for all parties. In this case, both for America and for its allies. And this concept comes from the classical age. In the political order of the Greek city-states, where you have Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and then finally Macedon ruling in predominance over the Greek world, without too excessive a coercion. And they had definite internal independence. The coercion that America uses as a hegemon is quite minimal, and the system that it and its allies labor under is for the clear benefit of all powers. Besides, America's influence on European immigration policy and the influence of the Black Civil Rights Movement in Europe, it's very difficult to find anything else that America has done with its allies that's detrimental. When confronted with its obvious reality, leftists often have to assert that third world countries do not have individual autonomy or agency. They will insist through conjecture that dictatorships they oppose, for instance Pinochet's Chile, Sherardo's Indonesia, or royalist Iran, were American puppet states, that these coups that occurred in these countries were not because of the result of any internal power struggles, but were solely done as the work of the United States. It's ironic that champions of racial minorities would view entire nations of non-whites as devoid of autonomy or agency, but the racism inherent in this worldview is necessary to demonize the United States as an actor within the 20th century. This school of thought thus fails to understand why the United States has been able to maintain its global influence and power. That reason is that the United States in its foreign policy for most of its history has been very pragmatic and non-ideological. That its minimal use of coercion and historical refusal to force its ideology on others has been the appeal of allying with the United States and allowing it to be the global policeman of the seas. In almost every respect, America's hegemony has been the greatest example of the liberal school of international relations put into action. The political system of Pax Americana, if you will, allows cooperation of states through interdependence, and the instances of international warfare have greatly diminished. In many ways, these leftists and their influence now is undermining America's power. They insist upon using America's soft power and hard power now to enforce their values upon other nations. Though most of the Cold War America would treat non-democratic states not as lesser states and gave them full sovereignty, now America uses its soft power to attempt these states, which it previously considered its equals, to be subject to coercion, which attempts to either force democracy on them, starting in the 90s with Serbia and South Africa, all the way into, imposing gay marriage, imposing the legalization of homosexuality upon them. And as the Cold War ended and the post-Cold War began, this promotion of democracy and so-called human rights was going to transform out of soft power into primarily military means. As the 21st century began, the promotion of democracy now includes support for sexual liberation and promiscuity, ultimately culminating in a foreign policy which actively tries to spread homosexuality throughout the world and considers nations who prohibit or limit the right of public homosexuals to be its enemies. So-called global homo. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union, on the other hand, was aggressively ideological, insisted on spreading Marxism-Leninism throughout the world using force if necessary. It rarely allied with non-Marxist nations and seldomly traded with them until the Brezhnev era. If a nation promoted a different type of socialism, then it would become an enemy of the Soviet Union. You got Titoism, you got Maoism, and you got socialism with a human base. And these are viewed as just as antagonistic as imperialism or capitalism. This led to the majority of nations around the world to become very anti-communist and anti-Soviet, ultimately limiting the possibility of having a great sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence it had was limited to Eastern European puppet states, or third world states that it had to buy through heavy commitments and foreign aid. On the converse, the United States opposed the majority of its enemies, not because of their ideology, but because of their aggression. In modern school books, this is being whitewashed, but World War II was really because of German aggression. It wasn't because of the Holocaust. It only became because of the Holocaust after the 1970s, and America became allied with Israel explicitly, and the Israeli lobby started to influence American domestic and foreign policy. Similarly, the United States wasn't very anti-communist if you're Yugoslavia, only if you're an aggressor like the Soviet Union, and it would ally and trade with both China and Yugoslavia. Something that's not talked about often in the history books is that a lot of Americans wanted to return to non-interventionism after the Second World War. And America, drew down its armed forces, and it was trying to return to some kind of traditional foreign policy. I mean, obviously, this clearly was shot down and defeated. But if you go into the Korean War, the reason why America got its ass kicked at the beginning is because it drove down its army. It pushed things back, and that's why the North Koreans were so able to overwhelm American forces when they did finally intervene. Of course, once Truman committed America to the Korean War, and then there was the second Red Scare, America has shifted basically ever since into the interventionism. But this was really to contain Soviet aggression. And so America, to contain Soviet aggression, would ally with European fascists. It would ally with juntas. It would ally with democracies. It would ally with apartheid states. It would ally with monarchies. It would ally with military dictatorships, right? Treating all of these as equal partners and independent states who, regardless of their internal government systems, were able to benefit under the American-led liberal world order of prosperity under free trade and safe seas of America's naval supremacy, and impenetrable interstate defense in its nuclear umbrella. America was so pragmatic with its allies, as I said before, that it would trade with Yugoslavia and China. This meant that the Cold War wasn't so much as a bipolar world order, but something akin to the besiegement of the single great power of the Soviet Union by an entire international community. In sum, the United States is a hegemon because America provides a great deal of advantage to the lesser partners. Part of America's decline is actually due to it abandoning Westphalian sovereignty and trying to promote democracy, and even more disparaging, promote its so-called human rights. And this began, at the end of the Cold War. The biggest example I can think of is the embargo of South Africa, which began in 1986, and then continues through the intervention in the Yugoslav Civil War by falsely accusing the Serbs of genocide. Then in 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, with this false accusation that Saddam was cooperating with Al-Qaeda. But later, it's going to be retrospectively justified under spreading democracy by force. And, in the intervention with Libya and the intervention in Syria, that's to ensure democratic victory, right? That's the justification. In the case of the Syrian civil war, they supported some far leftist Kurds, right? Which would ultimately alienate probably its most important ally to limit Russian power, Turkey. And they started using foreign aid at first to incentivize transition to a democratic system, and now they're using it as an incentive to allow increasing sexual liberalization and, of course, gay marriage. This shift to the aggressive promotion of social liberal values has alienated many nations and delegitimized U.S. power abroad. Since hegemony functioned under cooperation rather than coercion, it requires America to have high prestige for it to work. Once America loses its prestige, countries will drift away from this alliance and cooperation, and ultimately this unipolar world of American power which existed in the 90s and 2000s is going to go to the way of the dodo. Military power and expenditure along with power projection is not what's going to lead to that multipolar world, as there could have been a multipolar world the entire time. Because Britain, there's supposed to be this era of British supremacy in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but this entire era of British supremacy, this was a multipolar world. It was not a unipolar world. The American era of supremacy was a unipolar world because everyone wanted to function under American hegemony. It was beneficial for everyone except for, the contained Soviet Union. And now America is going to decline in relative terms to China and Russia, but ultimately one of the greatest drivers to this isn't just the rise of China again to become an economic power, but nobody wants to play with this fucking crazy nutcase America. While China will and is probably ultimately surpass the United States in purchasing power parity and GDP, eventually I believe it'll also surpass the United States in military expenditure. Pax Senatus is far less appealing than any Pax Americana. In the case of the Soviet Union and the modern United States, their hegemony isn't appealing because they were, and in the United States, are now aggressive in promoting their ideology and insisting on it for cooperation and trade. China, on the other hand, this isn't a problem because it's non-ideological. The reason that it's a problem for China is because Chinese chauvinism is so intense. This is not something that the neoconservatives just made up. This isn't some, you know, Russia's going to be overwhelmed by Chinese immigrants thing that neoconservatives say. This is real. Until Western powers and Japan imposed unequal treaties upon the Qing in the 19th century, the Chinese kind of viewed themselves as the sole power. The Chinese emperor was the one guy who ruled everything. This pre-humiliation era, the 1840s, before the 1840s, all of East Asian international affairs were organized under Chinese suzerainty, where all other states weren't actually states, but were given power through the emanation of China as the sole power which ruled all the world. And what we're seeing now, while isn't, a complete retrogression to this, it's that China doesn't see itself as an equal with its partners in either trade or military affairs. And it doesn't believe in Westphalian sovereignty. That's something that's below Chinese dignity. Unlike Western powers, it does not have a liberal understanding of civil citizenship. So while Americans view naturalized citizens and citizens through inheritance, regardless as their race or ethnic background, they have equal status. And if this is a far right wing channel, you can criticize all you want, but China and its cultural values view only ethnic Hans as true citizens, and internal minorities within the PRC are something less. But it also views ethnic Hans without its borders as Chinese citizens whose loyalty is first and foremost to the Chinese state. This is true of every Chinese overseas community across the world. While the sizable Chinese communities in the West, countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, are not subject to overt racism because of heavy Western taboos against it, the massive overseas communities of Chinese, they're deeply resented in Southeast Asia by the ethnic majorities. The Chinese in these countries are often more economically successful than the rest of their countrymen. But they remain culturally segregated, in many cases not only never assimilating, but they continue to live in Chinatowns and sometimes don't even learn the native language, despite having lived in these countries for decades or even centuries. While anti-American attitudes do exist in its allied countries in Europe, the Middle East, and South Korea, this resentment is centered mostly either for disdain of American cultural influence or because they believe that America is insufficiently liberal or insufficiently American. Asian resentment for the Chinese is far more deep-seated, vehement, and racial in nature. To be blunt, the French, Germans, or South Koreans who think Americans are fat and stupid, they don't see America as like an existential threat that's going to wipe them out. The Filipinos, Thais, Malays, and Japanese quite clearly do, meaning that this hegemony that the United States enjoys will never exist for China because nobody likes the People's Republic of China. And even worse, very few like the Chinese. And this is due to both their own cultural outlook and because of the deep-seated resentment of other Asian nations. A lot of people point to China's championing of international organizations today as an indicator of Chinese hegemony to come being exercised through these organizations. Leftists would point to the legitimacy of international bodies such as the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank as a key aspect of America's empire. But if this is true, the Chinese alternatives don't even try to obscure their impartiality. The Chinese use the international bodies, both the legacy ones that are supposed to be American organs of imperialism, and their replacements, which solely serve the Chinese, which are created by the Chinese for the benefit of China. Again, the Chinese do not have an ideological or cultural commitment to any concept of Westphalian sovereignty, nor to the liberal school of international relations. Leftist academics will insist of America's extreme racism in its foreign policy. But you gotta remember the United States was once a colony and it's sympathetic to former colonies as well. And following the good neighbor policy on, America has tried to view all non-Western states as sovereign entities equal to itself or European powers. And sure, it's used its soft power and diplomacy to foster decolonization. China's foreign policy, on the other hand, stresses enslaving other countries into debt traps, which are more severe than anything the IMF or World Bank has ever done. And this is sparking widespread resentment throughout Africa, and I think in the coming decades there's going to be a great deal of resentment in the Central Asian nations as the investments of the Belt and Road Initiative come to fruition, and it becomes apparent that these are also debt traps. I think that the reasons that China will not become a hegemon ultimately lie on the international scene. It's also important to know that China's economic growth will not and cannot continue indefinitely. Even as I've said before, I think Chinese, in terms of total domestic product, has surpassed the United States. This growth is already beginning to slow and will ultimately stagnate in the coming years. While China has not imported millions of immigrants, it still has a pretty bad demographic situation. Its birth rate is below the replacement of, the magic number of 2.1, usually hovering somewhere around 1.6 and 1.7. A declining birth rate will bring stagnation and reduced living standards eventually. And they can't get past this declining birth rate because the One China policy established a bureaucracy of tax farming where people have to get their pregnancies approved and pay in order to do so. And this one-child policy has a legacy of sex-selective abortions, and many of these men are going to be unmarried and lonely. And as they get older, we can expect them to have a suicide at an ever-increasing rate. Declining birth rates generally tend to favor the fertility of the less intelligent and more impulsive, and this results in declining capital. Because of the one-child policy, China's average age is actually higher than the age in the United States, meaning that the stagnation will come much sooner than previously thought. A large part of economic growth has been predicated upon its exports to richer nations. This is how each of the Asian tigers actually became a high-income economy. The reason is because China's low labor costs attracted foreign investment in manufacturing. As China became a more wealthy country, the cost of labor increased and the labor ceased to become competitive in the international marketplace. Ultimately, this means that the country will become stuck in what is known as the middle income trap due to the laws of the supply and demand. The clearest way to escape this, and this is what the Asian tigers did in the 1990s, is develop high-end manufactured goods, something that China has not yet done. There is good reason to believe that China has such a massive internal market that eventually its growth will result mostly due to internal trade. But this growth will be slower than the previous growth, which was predicated upon exports. It's also important to note that there will be many economic bubbles that China's economy has fostered on its way up and will pop and lead to recessions. Even though China is already or will soon surpass the United States, again, I'm fucking saying this as a broken record, its total economic output, it will probably never attain the relative share that the United States' economy had during its peak, or even 10 years ago. The final field which prevents China from attaining hegemon status is its military power. In the field which is clearly the most important, naval warfare. The reason that the West was able to be so powerful for the past 500 years is because of its supremacy in naval warfare. and the easiest and most efficient way to transport trade goods remains by way of sea. British and American global power projection was entirely predicated on naval power, and their influence as such was largely due to their unprecedented and inescapable naval supremacy. A lot of people talk about Mackinder's theory of the world island, or the heartland, and how this would mean that China is going to become geopolitically unassailable. The idea is that the old world formed some kind of giant island, and that control of Central Asia and Northern Eurasia, where Russia is the most important factor in determining global power projection and economic prosperity. Nations at the periphery of this one world island, such as the United States, Japan, and the British Isles, would be put at a disadvantage if this world island was ever unified. I'm going to say this right now. I unequivocally and unilaterally think it's bullshit. Sir Alfred Mackinder was a British professional geographer during the Edwardian era, and the entire theory is transparently a justification of British rivalry with Russia during the Great Game period. That's when the two great powers, the British Empire and the Russian Empire, were competing over influence in Central Asia. Russia's expansion in Asia posed no threat to the British mainland, so there needed to be some justification for this intervention, and that's what the world island or heartland theory, or pivot theory, if you will, comes in. It's just bullshit made up by the British to justify the wars in Afghanistan that they fought, to try and prevent Russian expansion. If this theory, the heartland theory, was true, Russia would be completely insaleable. Now, during the Soviet Union, during the Russian Empire, but the opposite is clearly true. Russia's position, even if it has a big population, they're very strong and it has a lot of resources. From a geographic standpoint, is very weak. It has no natural borders. The reason that why Russia is repeatedly so aggressive in its history is that it continuously tries to expand its borders further from its heartland to try and create some kind of defendable proxy from foreign invasions. Russia ultimately has been invaded multiple times because it's so easy to invade. It is a nightmare trying to defend a flat steppe land. As such, modern commentators are digging up Mackinder's theories and then apply them in China instead of declining Russia. Some are doing this to argue in China's favor as an unassailable superpower. Some are doing it to try and isolate China, use it again as justification for aggression towards China. And oftentimes these people that are going to point this out are going to be like, ho ho ho, look at China's global infrastructure project. The Belt and Road Initiative of building up infrastructure in central China and cementing control over the insaleable heartland. The reality is that China is in a weak position, just like Russia is. The vast majority of China's economic trade goes through the Straits of Malacca, a thin channel between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, which the overwhelming majority of trade between the Pacific and Indian Oceans must go through. Besides the economic profits that depend upon the strait, there is also the fact that China is not food self-sufficient. China doesn't domestically produce enough food to feed its people, and a large amount of the food it needs must come through the Strait of Malacca. The Belt and Road Initiative, in reality, rather than cementing China's control of the heartland, is actually a an ill-fated and probably failed attempt at relieving its shipping weakness in the Malacca Strait. It would be very easy for any country to have access to the strait to cut off trade and impose dire consequences upon the Chinese economy and food security if they ever went into a war with China. China has very little naval tradition compared to the United States, Great Britain, Japan, or actually even Russia. There is a misnomer that it's the largest navy in the world because people are counting its small coastal patrol boats as part of its navy. while countries like the United States, these small postal control boats are going to be listed under something like the Coast Guard or the local police forces or paramilitaries. In reality, the Chinese Navy is utterly dwarfed by the American Navy when it comes to tonnage. It will take decades for China's Navy to approach the power that the United States currently has today. I want to make this clear. I'm not arguing that America will maintain its military power or some kind of supremacy even into the next decade. I think it will quickly pull back from the world in the coming decades. Rather, I'm saying that China will not be able to emulate and take the place of America once America has faded into the distance. Beyond the fact that China has to generate a naval tradition that has never previously held, it has a very weak starting point. The majority of strategic islands across the Pacific and Indian Oceans are controlled by the United States and its Western allies, who are also part of NATO, and this severely limits the ability of Chinese naval power projection in the future as it does now. China is thus forced to do one of two things to create overseas military bases. The first thing is what it does in the South China Sea, and that's to build artificial islands. That's where they take a coral reef, dump concrete and steel on it until it becomes an island. The second thing is to force other countries into debt traps and force them doing so to hand over land. And then, of course, there's the third option that China could get: direct military confrontation. Obviously, this option is off the table with the current global system, as the United States nuclear umbrella protects the nations of Asia, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean from Chinese aggression. But I believe very strongly that America is going to retract from the world stage as its demographics and internal contradictions cause it to collapse within. When this happens, the nuclear umbrella which America has will retract its power, forcing East Asian countries to either accept Chinese supremacy or to build effective deterrence against its aggression. Given the history of almost all of these countries having a deep-seated resentment towards China and their colonization by Japan and Western powers, I believe that they will double down on maintaining their sovereignty by building credible defenses and deterrences. I think that once the American Navy fades upon the world stage and that nuclear umbrella is gone, there will be a rapid and intense nuclear proliferation in the region. North Korea already has nuclear weapons, and Taiwan, before it democratized, had nearly built them. Taiwan, along with South Korea and Japan, have nuclear reactors, and it would be very beneficial for them to develop nuclear weapons in the coming years. The final question about all this you have to ask yourself is, would China really want to emulate the power that the United States had in the 1990s or the 2000s or even in the Cold War? It clearly wants to force Taiwan back under its rule, but what does it want to do beyond that? Does it want to annex Mongolia? Does it want to get back Outer Manchuria from Russia? Does it want to use its navy as a global policeman? If it could convince others that it could act as a benevolent hegemon, would it expand its reach past its traditional power structure? I don't really think so. The post-American world, which in many respects has already begun, will not be dominated by another hegemon. First, because no nation will be able to have such a disproportionate share again in military, economic, or cultural power. And secondly, as it no longer is advantageous for any country to operate in this largely benevolent role as a hegemon. Rather, this world will be multipolar and divided into the shares of influence of competing great powers. Now, we already have China and Russia as rising great powers. And you're going to have countries like India, France, maybe Britain, and maybe Germany. You got Turkey already. Saudi Arabia and Iran will be great powers with their spheres of influence. It's not clear what's going to happen to America right now. Whether it's going to Latinize as an English-speaking nation amongst the Americas, or if it's going to be divided like the former Soviet Union. These great powers will have to share their influence without the American nuclear umbrella. and compete with a predominance of sovereign middle powers as well. This world in turn will ultimately only be transitory before the natural resources which industrial civilization depends upon will be exhausted and things return once and for all back to normal.